All right, looks like we're coming up to the time here. Just a few more seconds.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the National Speech and Debate Association Senior Open Public Forum Showcase Round, featuring On the Con and Speaking First, the team of Carter Teagan and Kevin Zhang from Thomas S. Wooten High School, versus the Pro Speaking Second, the team of Vinay Dupakula and Joey Huang from Winston Churchill High School. Gentlemen, have a great round.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is everybody ready?
Carter, make sure you do the thing, you know, the start of your speech. Yeah, just a reminder.
No.
What? Why?
Okay, fine.
Okay, good.
All
right.
Are y'all ready? All right. For the last time ever, Thomas Wooten engaged Contention 1 as oil shocks. Despite COVID, Fasty of the New York Times explains that the U.S. still sanctions medical equipment from entering Iran. Thus, if the U.S. withdraws its navy, Iran would act quickly. Kalanick of Stanford confirms that affirming would lead Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, believing it could be used as a bargaining chip to exchange for the lifting of U.S. sanctions, allowing imports of necessary medicine. Even if Iran doesn't, Kopitz of CNBC explains that the fear of the strait's potential closure would lead investors to suspend oil tankers from being shipped and charge exorbitant risk premiums. In the worst case, he concludes that oil prices would soar to $200. Problematically, oil price spikes raise production, living, and food costs, creating an unexpected surge in expenses for households living on less than $1 a day. The World Bank quantifies that even a short-term spike in food prices would push over 1 billion people into poverty. Contention 2 is the Kurds. A U.S. withdrawal puts the Kurds, an ethnic group, in danger for 2 reasons. Subpoint A is Turkey. Turkey views the Kurds as a terrorist organization. Kingsley of the New York Times confirms that the Turkish leader believes that the Kurds are an existential threat, pledging to carry out an ethnic cleansing. This isn't just rhetoric. ABC News explains that the last time the U.S. withdrew from Syria, Turkey invaded with the Kurds in their sight. By the time the U.S. halted their withdrawal, over 100,000 Kurds were already displaced. Thus, a complete military withdrawal would greenlight a Turkish genocide, threatening the livelihoods of 7 million Iraqi Kurds. Subpoint B is uprisings. The Kurds have been at peace in Iraq. BBC News writes that the Kurds live in an autonomous province in Iraq which have been protected by the US for decades. Absent America, the Kurds would be oppressed. Nowak of the Washington Post confirms that without US protection, Kurds would be oppressed by the Iraqi government and the Shia Muslim militias. This would lead to a bloody confrontation. Cuff of Newsweek writes that when groups lose autonomy, they turn to violence to get it back, quantifying that losing autonomy in every case led to widespread violence. History agrees. Nazet of Foreign Affairs writes that following the U.S. withdrawal in 2011, Iraq saw a spike in sectarian violence leading to the rise of ISIS. He concludes that another withdrawal would reignite widespread sectarian violence, sparking a civil war. Worse, because Iraq borders Iran, Detmer of the CSIS explains that Iran would be reeled in, causing a full-blown civil war that would kill millions. Kurdish violence would go regional. Smith of the ISR writes that a violent Iraqi Kurds uprising would catalyze Kurds in Turkey, Iran, and Syria to join in. She furthers that Shia militant groups like Hezbollah would retaliate violently, causing an explosion of conflict throughout the region, killing tens of millions. Contention 3 is nuclearization. Saudi Arabia is investing in nuclear energy. Aleem of Vox News explains that Saudi Arabia is building 16 nuclear reactors which are dual use and can create nuclear weapons. Fortunately, Saudi Arabia has no plans to proliferate. Theo of the National Review explains that Saudi Arabia sees no reason to nuclearize because they feel protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella. However, a U.S. withdrawal would erode trust in the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Gazansky of Harvard thus confirms that the fear of facing a nuclear Iran alone would lead Saudi Arabia to acquire nuclear weapons first. Nuclearization would destabilize the region in 2 ways. First is proxy wars. Meyer of the CSIS explains that because a nuclear Saudi Arabia can threaten nuclear escalation to deter larger powers, it will start 54% more proxy wars. Problematically, the National Research Council quantifies that a regional escalation would put 44 million aid-dependent civilians at risk. Second is an Israel preemptive strike. The long-term threat of a nuclear Saudi on its border would be unacceptable. The CFR thus concludes that Israel would detect and preemptively strike Saudi's nuclear program in its early stages. Precedent exists. Rosen writes that Israel has historically gone to preemptive war with Egypt and also launched preemptive attacks on Iraq and Syria's nuclear program. More importantly, the CFR explains that such an Israeli attack on Saudi Arabia, the Gulf leader, would incite an unprecedented level of radicalization against Israel, resulting in region-wide conflict between Arab states and Israel, killing tens of millions. Thus, we negate.
Okay. So okay, is everybody ready? Okay. Give me actually one more second here. Okay. All right. My time starts now. Oh wait, actually, sorry, not yet. For pretty much the first and last time ever, Winston Churchill affirms time starts now. My Joey and I affirm contention 1 is peace in Yemen. In the Yemen war, Saudi Arabia is committed to a total war strategy, using all means at its disposal, no matter how harsh, to win. Yet, despite this strategy, Saudi Arabia is slowly losing the war. Jamestown 20 writes that the Houthis, Saudi Arabia's enemies in Yemen, have gradually been gaining ground. For example, the Houthis captured Joff last month, a major province on Saudi borders. U.S. military presence is the only thing keeping Saudi Arabia from caving in. Parsi 19 explains that our troops act as a security guarantee, assuring Saudi Arabia that we will bail them out if necessary. This has served as a blank check for the Saudis to continue aggression. Without our security guarantee, Saudi Arabia has too much to lose and will be forced to the negotiating table. History agrees. Parsi continues that recently, when Trump merely threatened to withdraw presence, Saudi Arabia conceded to talks, leading to an 80% reduction in airstrikes and no deaths for 2 weeks. But even if negotiations fail, Bandaw Cato writes that without a U.S. pullout or forces for Saudi Arabia to retreat from Yemen to focus on domestic security, hastening inevitable Houthi victory. Without Saudi Arabia, its coalition will willingly draw or withdraw and be crushed. Horton 20 of Jamestown writes that absent Saudi Arabia, the Houthis can focus on smaller regional groups who, without Saudi backing, stand no chance against a concentrated Houthi effort. Ending the war just 1 year quicker is critical, as the UN finds that every year the crisis continues, tens of thousands die and millions are displaced. Our second contention is saving Iraq. UCLA 20 explains the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani by U.S. military forces has created a tinderbox situation that could easily erupt into war between the U.S. and Iran. Mali of Foreign Policy 20 contextualizes that there has been a steady stream of incidents in Iraq from January to just days ago. Fisher of the NYT explains that each cycle of tit-for-tat escalation has, rather than forcing the other side to back down, led the other to ramp up. UCLA 20 concludes that with no endgame in sight, the U.S. and Iran are headed for military conflict. This can happen in 3 ways. First is a U.S. miscalculation. The Washington Post 19 confirms that the current political situation in the U.S. is the perfect storm for miscalculation. UCLA 20 contextualizes that the U.S. strategy of maximum pressure has become a self-fulfilling prophecy in which the U.S. government is convinced that Iran is an imminent threat to its troops in Iraq and can only be defeated through military force. For this reason, FARDA 20 of the Pentagon has issued a confidential order planning on operation against Iran-backed militias in Iraq within the next few weeks. Second is an Iranian diversion. Iran is desperate for the political victory. Byman of Vox 20 finds that protests in Iran have swept more than 100 cities, descending the country into chaos. However, recent U.S. military pressure has enabled Iran to portray the U.S. as the aggressor, creating a timely diversion for Iran and feeding the narrative that the U.S. aggression, rather than the Iranian regime's own abuses, is the cause of their woes. Compares to the JTA concludes that the regimes under siege from all sides and with no diplomatic exit ramp will calculate a confrontation with the U.S. would be a good distraction. Third is Iranian-backed Iraqi militias. Memory 20 finds that on April 4th, national resistance factions in Iraq issued a statement declaring American forces as occupation forces. Fulton of Vice 19 continues that these militias don't accept any violation of Iraqi sovereignty and therefore stated that as long as the Americans are still here, it's impossible to put down our weapons. Memory continues that these pro-Iranian militias want the U.S. to take uncalculated military action because U.S. resources are stretched thin internally, and it would expose the U.S. to local criticism, which would shore up support for U.S. removal. Ultimately, a U.S.-Iran war would be devastating. Gabbard 19 confirms that a U.S.-Iran war in Iraq would make the previous Iraq war look like a cakewalk, killing millions and fracturing the entire region into chaos. By contrast, if the U.S. withdrew its military presence, the U.S.-Iran could reach a diplomatic solution. Campeas continues that Iran's economic vulnerability serves as a diplomatic opportunity, as they're willing to take a diplomatic exit round. However, UCLA explains that as long as U.S. military presence remains in the region, Iran would see such an agreement as a capitulation to the United States. For these reasons, we are more than proud to affirm.
Ready for cross? Okay, so let's talk about your second contention about an Iraq war. When is this full-blown war going to start happening?
Yeah, so basically, I can't really give you a timetable per se because wars are unpredictable. But our point is that the status quo is trending towards conflict. So if you continue on the status quo, eventually it'll spill over. Can I ask you a question, Carter?
No, wait, I want to spend some more time on this. So let's talk about this FARDA evidence, right? It says that there's going to be a conflict or like miscalc in the next few weeks, right?
Yeah.
When was this
Well,
evidence?
no. FARDA says that there's an order. They're going to plan an operation in the next few weeks.
Okay.
It's not per se a miscalculation. It's more of a U.S. planned
So
attack.
when was this order set? When did this evidence come out?
I can look at the
2
date.
months ago. So why hasn't that order fallen through yet?
So Carter, people give timetables, but first of all, it's from April. But second of all, which was only a month ago. So yeah, maybe it took a little bit longer than expected. But the point is the fact that the U.S. is gearing up, the fact that the U.S. has moved missile defense systems as well as bases into this area shows that the U.S. is preparing. When, I don't know, but the fact that it's trending in that direction is a problem. Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Okay, so let's talk about nuclearization.
Yeah.
So ultimately, in 2014, did Saudi Arabia look to nuclearize when the U.S. pulled out?
It was only a very short period, and they were just recalibrating.
Okay, so
time, right?
let's talk about this a little bit further, though. Let's say Saudi Arabia nuclearizes or tries to nuclearize. Israel, you say, has preemptively struck in the past, right? Like they've struck Iraq and I think Syria or something you mentioned. What happened?
Sure, you want to tell me?
Nothing. Literally nothing. They struck at a low level. The missile, like the operations stopped, but no war ensued. So why is this situation unique?
Oh, because Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest leaders in the Middle East, and they pose a far bigger threat than like Egypt. Syria.
Wait, why though? Why does that matter? Like, if they attack at such a low level, like war is detrimental for any country, right? So why would any country want to get into a conflict unless they absolutely have to?
Well, because Israel fears Saudi Arabia on its border with nuclear weapons, so they're going to want to escalate it. And
but
Saudi Arabia isn't going to stop pursuing nuclear weapons, so that's why.
My point is that even if Israel fears, Israel also struck Iraq when they were pretty powerful, and it didn't lead to conflict. So I'm not really understanding why Israel striking Saudi Arabia at a very low level is going to ensue this conflict that you keep talking about.
Right, because Saudi Arabia isn't going to stop pursuing nuclear weapons, which means Israel's going to only
I mean, if they haven't done it in the past, then I don't know why they would do it in the future if it could potentially lead to some conflict that they don't really want. Like you say, they're going to build nukes for national security, right?
Sure.
Isn't it completely against national security to get into a conflict?
It's like a catch-22 because they fear Iran way more than they fear Israel. So they're going to nuclearize and take that.
Why do they need to nuclearize to combat Iran?
Oh, that's cross.
I'm going to run some prep time starting now. That was 1 minute of prep time. So it's going to start with, let me think. It's going to start with 2 overviews and then down your case. And then it'll go back to my case and weigh on my case if we have time. So
are these disads or like offensive overviews?
they're offensive overviews.
Gotcha.
Okay, give me a second to get water. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, cool. So without further ado, time begins now. 2 overviews. First is Iran. What Brookings explains that Iran goals, moderates and harders alike since its 1979 revolution has been to attain regional hegemony. And Carafana explains that without the US presence to deter them, Iran would expand into over 10 proxy flashpoints in Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, and Libya, putting over 44 million lives at risk. And this is why when the United States left Syria, Iran immediately filled the void and strengthened their ISIS resurgence. This outweighs their case in 2 ways. Number 1 is on scope, because we're talking about regional destabilization versus their one specific conflict in either Iran or Iraq or Yemen. But secondly, we're also going to outweigh on a link in, because we say when Iran becomes more aggressive, that means that they fund more Iraq proxies, which also means that we're going to see more militias there and more potential for conflict. The second overview is that Saudi Arabia is going to freak out. What Tassi explains that because Saudi Arabia believes that any compromise with Iran is capitulation to their power, Saudi Arabia's response to withdrawal has historically been to aggress, invading in Yemen and blockading Qatar. And what Goss explains that the Saudi Salman doctrine promises to fill any deadly void the United States leaves with more aggression, which by Leeds of Rice explains that states without a security guarantee start 28% more conflicts. Once again, this is going to outweigh their scope. 1, on scope because it's regional destabilization, but 2, it's also going to outweigh on probability because we've historically seen it lead to conflict, whereas all of their case should have already happened. Let's go to their case though. On their first contingent about Yemen, there's a lot of responses. 3 reasons why Yemen conflict is still going to continue. Number 1 is security. Safar explains that it cannot tolerate an Iran-backed Houthi on their border, which is why Saudi Arabia will continue to persecute the war even if they're losing. But the second is on oil, because Offman explains that Saudi Arabia has no oil and they're running out of oil exports, which is why they need Yemen oil and they're invading in the status quo for it. The third reason is nationalism. What Behran explains that they invaded Saudi Arabia for nationalism and to get a political victory despite the coronavirus destroying their economy. And we say that because war is inevitable, the United States leaving would make it worse for 2 reasons. Number 1 is we lose leverage. What Rogan explains that Saudi Arabia, although it's still too aggressive with its force, the United States is a moderating force that makes it target specific military posts instead of entire city blocks, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. But the second thing is that without the United States logistics and intelligence operations, Saudi Arabia will no longer be able to operate its air force. It's going to turn to using its ground troops instead, which the New York Times explains causes a lot more collateral damage because it fights through all the way to its target versus an airplane just goes overhead, doesn't actually hit the civilians that are going to be impacted the most. But then on their party evidence, there's 2 responses. Number 1, it concedes that there's alternate causes for why Saudi Arabia came to the table. In fact, things like Saudi Arabia recalibrating to regroup and breathe and then launching a new wave of violence against Iran. But the second thing is that this ceasefire they talk about only lasted 2 weeks, which proves that even though nothing really changed, Saudi Arabia was never actually fully committed, and that's for the 3 reasons I gave above. But then we say you can turn it because the New York Times indicates that the Houthis only ever come to the table when they want to regroup and breathe, and then once again launch a new wave of conflict. So all these ceasefires only lead to more conflict later on. Let's go to their contention to about saving Iraq. 2 over-shelf responses. Number 1 comes from Alum, who indicates that if the United States withdraws from the region, it will legitimize the ideologies of Iran heartlands, that aggression and force is the way to get the United States out of the region. This also includes like feisty Saudi Arabia and Israel after the United States leaves, which actually turns their arguments. But secondly, any sort of escalation is only posturing, because Bloomberg explains that Iran plays a strategy of gray zone escalation, where they can claim that they respond to the United States, but never actually fully escalate to war. On their first thing about U.S. miscalc, number 1, how is Iran an existential threat to the United States? That makes no sense. But 2, the CNN explains that 75% of Americans oppose war, so Trump would never intentionally start a war. But 3rd, Trump also has based his entire election around economics, and we say any sort of conflict with Iran would lead to an explosion of oil prices, which once again would make so that he cannot win his election for 2020. He would never risk it. Then they say they're going to start an op in Iraq, but we say number 1, this evidence literally concedes that generals are opposed to it. But second, this was from March 26, which was 2 months ago. It should have already happened. Let's go to the second word on political victory. 3 responses. Number 1, after U.S. sanctions in 2017 or 2018, we should have saw this happen because there were already protests and lots of economic decline for Iran. There was no diversion conflict they talk about. But secondly, we say that in the past 30 years, there have definitely been times when Iran has had bad economics, but they never launched a war. But 3rd, if this really was true, they would just start conflict elsewhere for other diversionary tactics. It doesn't have to be the United States. On the 3rd one about militias, 2 responses. Number 1, the militias have always been there. Why is there, there's literally no time for militias argument. When is there actually going to be a war? No explanation. But secondly, we all see that our counterterrorism operations are limiting these militias and keeping them from becoming large actual threats. In fact, we tell you that, for example, ISIS has been down 98% of their land because of U.S. counterterrorism operations.
Mr. Kevin, you were going really quick. What was your third response on our second link?
On your second link about political victory.
That's right.
If they wanted a political victory, they would just start conflicts in other areas of the region.
Gotcha.
It doesn't have to be with the United States.
Perfect. Thank you.
I need to go grab my charger really quick, so I'll be right back.
This is not prep time.
Oh, it's not? Okay. Then why are you writing the neck? Oh, okay.
What's up? Oh, I'm not ready.
All right.
I was just writing your response because you were going really fast. So
I didn't think he was going that fast.
well, it's supposed to be public forum, and I'm not used to this kind of speed. I'm more used to a public approach, which is why I talk slow. But
Oh, okay.
it's okay. Everyone's different, right? So Joe, read the 6 overviews. Oh shit.
You mean the diss ads?
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay,
Yeah.
now we're gonna start prep.
Kevin, pick up the phone.
All right, that was like a minute.
Did you just say that was a minute? Vinay, Carter and I
That's
were in a
3
call
minutes,
for 3 minutes. There's no way that was 1 minute.
Is that 3 minutes?
Yeah, we'll do 3 minutes. Even though we started our call a little bit late too. We'll give him some pity prep. It's okay.
We have 3 minutes left, you're saying? That's why I said it was 1 minute.
You have 1 minute left.
Okay. The order will be frontlining your case. Is everybody ready? All right. Let's begin on their first overview about Iran. They just say that without the US in the region, Iran will expand. But the problem is, according to Pilar of the National Interest, they find that Iran only aggressive because they feel threatened by the US military presence. And they know that if they were truly to expand in the region, they would literally get crushed by all their other neighbors. So we'd argue the same thing applies. Even if the US isn't there, they still know they're going to get crushed because all the other countries have much more military expenditure than them. That's why in the past, like their Syria example about them expanding their land bridge is not even true. They said it literally says they plan to do it, and not that it actually happened. Then you can also just cross-apply like our entire contention too as the reasons why Iran is only aggressive with the US in the region. Then on our second overview about Saudi Arabia freaking out, one, we'll concede the idea that the war is non-unique. So at that point, they don't have much offense coming off of this because they don't tell you how much necessarily Saudi Arabian aggression gets worse. But secondly, you can also cross-apply the Parsi evidence, which indicates the last time the US started to withdraw our troops, they literally actually decreased and went to diplomacy. On our contention one by Yemen, again, we'll concede the dealing. They don't really give you much contextualization as to how much the war actually gets much worse. Don't buy this whatsoever. On our contention two about Iran, their first response is that hardliners will just get emboldened. But the problem is hardliners just want power. And insofar as they want power, we would argue that when right now, if the US were to go to diplomacy with our troops still there, that would signal to them a victory because that means that with the US in the region, the US has already conceded. However, they want to negotiate, but the only way they said they would actually negotiate is if the US leaves the region. Then they said that they have a gray zone strategy. No, this is clearly not working. They've been going tit for tat for multiple months, and literally the Soleimani killing was a miscalculation because clearly they did not want Soleimani to die. Clearly they're miscalculating. Their grain zone strategy is not working very well. On their first subpoint, we'll concede the dealing that war is not going to happen through that method. Then on our subpoint B, their first responses are both how like economic situations are really bad and we should have seen it happen. One, we would say the situation is uniquely really bad. The combination of even heavier and very heavy sanctions right now and coronavirus is uniquely why Iran would go to war right now. Then they try and say that conflict can just stir elsewhere, but the whole motive behind the hardliners is that they want to get the United States out to show their sign of power. At that point, we would say the only way that they actually have a legitimate diversion in their war is by attacking the US. Then on militias, they first say the militias will always be there, but uniquely what's unique now is that militias right now want to push the United States out. They've recently voted to push the United States out, which is why their motives are unique now. And they try and say that there's militias always there, but one, we say that radicalization always gets worse with the US there because it leads to like anti-American sentiment, and two, it's clearly not working right now because the militias are very, very intense right now. Let's go to their case. On their first contention about oil, you can first cross-apply the Iran turn that we put on their overview, which also takes out this because that means Iran has no incentive. But we would also argue that Iran cannot close the Strait of Hormuz for three reasons. A, the cost of closing the strait would hurt Iran's economy more than anyone else because 2/3 of their government's budget literally comes from oil, which flows to the Strait of Hormuz. Two, it would reduce any leverage Iran actually gets over the region. But three, in order to close the strait, Iran would be forced to place mines every day, which they don't have the capability to. That's why they've historically never done this. There's no probability to this. On their second contention about Turkey, a few responses. One, COVID-19 explains that after Syria, the Kurds lost all faith in the US troops and sent a clear message that the US is not a reliable partner. Now the New York Times explains they're already turning to anti-US allies who will protect them either way. Secondly, the New York Times indicates that 500 troops have been redeployed to Syria after the Kurdish attack. Following the deployment, no attacks have been conducted on Kurds. This shows that even if we move nearly all our troops, the remaining small presence will still be enough to deter Turkey. But lastly, even if Turkey wanted to go and persecute the Kurds, whenever they wanted to go persecute the Kurds, we just conceded. This is because we have a relationship with Turkey, but not with the Kurds. So when push comes to shove, it doesn't even matter if the US is there to begin with. Then on the subpoint three, contention three about the nukes, which we're probably going to go for. A few responses here. One, the New York Times indicates that Iran's already nuclearizing, which is important because MBS publicly declared he would nuclearize if Iran did. Secondly, Turkey's also getting nukes, which Saudi Arabia probably also perceives that as a threat. Third, we would say that Saudi Arabia is also already in a non-proliferation treaty. They're not going to do it anyway. Fourth, Asghar the News explains that Saudi Arabia would be unable to build a nuclear weapon because the United Nations Security Council wouldn't do it. Fifth, they want international support through the economic diversification campaign, which they would definitely lose if they were to start nuclearizing, like Iran got sanctions put on them. And finally, the impact. One, there's no historical precedent, and two, Israel and Saudi Arabia are developing relationships right now.
Kevin will call after cross.
me a second. Can we call right now, actually? Okay. All right, I'm calling you right now. Okay, that was 1 minute 50, and we used 1 minute before, so we have 1 minute 10 seconds left. Okay, I guess I have first question, Joey.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so time begins now. So on our contention 3 about nuclearization, you say there's no historical precedent. What do you mean by that? On our impact, you say there's no historical.
In first cross.
Right. So what historical examples should there have been war?
Well, you gave me 2 examples of first strikes, right?
We gave you 3, and the one that we gave you was
okay.
Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. And what happened when Israel launched a preemptive strike on Egypt?
Hold on. One was because of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that Egypt example is not related to nukes.
It was a preemptive strike on a large Arab nation.
Yeah, but
now
not,
Iraq and Syria are not Arab nations, though, so it's different because I think you're missing the nuance of our argument, right? Which is our CFR evidence says that for Saudi Arabia, they have a mosque there that is very religiously important across all the Arab nations, which is why if Israel launched a strike, that's what would create the regional war. And also Saudi Arabia is the Arab nation's leader, so it's a lot different than Iraq or Syria.
Yeah, let's talk about your CFR evidence. Like,
yeah, sure.
Like, what is it?
What do you mean? What is it?
Like,
do you want me to read it to you?
Where is it from?
Where is it from?
Yeah.
What
it's
the
from
Council of Foreign Relations
making a congressional testimony. So
well, yeah, you know, in order to give a congressional testimony, you have to do lots of research to be considered an expert on whatever you're talking about. So I think that's pretty reliable. Like,
okay,
I think
why is it why is it the only place that says like Israel is an existential threat to Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia is an existential threat?
It's definitely just not the only one. There's been 3 Israeli versus Arab nation wars in the past. Yeah, like it's not like some random assertion.
Those were decades ago, though, right?
So it's not like, okay, well, what changed between those decades? Did they become different religions? No.
We've seen tensions definitely decrease between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and we've seen diplomacy also begin to happen between Israel.
There's no diplomacy between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and in response to the thing about them having better relations, that's to band up against Iran, right? We agree to that, but right, it's a difference between it's like, you know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, but never for long, right? Because those theological, ideological, and religious differences that existed before they became friends to partner against Iran are still going to exist.
Would you say that to them, Iran is the bigger threat over any of these like minor like disputes?
Well, not if Saudi Arabia, who's on their border, develops a nuclear weapon. No.
Why?
Because they're on their border. Like proximity is a huge thing.
Why does Israel think that Saudi Arabia would suddenly just?
Well, they've had historical beef.
Do to them with nukes?
I don't know, nuke them.
But yeah, but like,
or be more aggressive with their nukes, right? Like, there's so many things that you are opening up Like the possibility, like the realm of possibilities that are opened up once Saudi Arabia gets nukes is endless. That's why for Israel, their calculus is start a war now,
Why would Saudi
end
Arabia
the Saudi Arabian ability to
why would Saudi
nuclearize, or
Arabia
wait.
nuke Israel for no reason?
Why would they don't just, I told you, there's still like theological and ideological differences that
So
still persist.
they're gonna nuke them over a mosque with no provocation.
Okay, you have to understand. Okay, if I was Vinay, I'd give you a history lesson about religion and why it's super important in the region. But our evidence is very explicit that it is a super important mosque that across the entire region, it would literally like create havoc, and all the Arab nations would unite together.
Right now.
Because Saudi Arabia is not nuclearizing.
Wait, you're saying Israel's gonna? Wait, no, I'm saying why does Saudi Arabia? Why would Israel think Saudi Arabia has an incentive to attack them?
Well, because there are ideological differences. It's like, look, the realm of possibilities is just so, like, maybe they don't have conflicts right now, but in the future, if they do have a conflict, Saudi Arabia can always hold this nuclear weapon over Israel's head, and Israel can't tolerate that, which is why they make the calculus to eliminate the program now instead of waiting 20 years down the line, where then there's a huge conflict and they have to deal with the nuclear power, and that's time.
Yeah.
Okay, Carter, I'm gonna call you again, or can you call me? Because that's easier. All right, that's the remainder of our prep time.
Sorry, I was muted. The structure is going to be starting on our subpoint beyond contention 2, then get to contention 3 about nuclearization, and then your case. Okay. Is everybody ready? All right. Start off on our contention 2 about the Kurds. All the responses they make on our subpoint A don't respond to it. Our subpoint B about uprising is pretty specific. Our BBC evidence indicates that the Kurds live in an autonomous region in Iraq, which are protected by U.S. troops. However, once you remove the U.S. military presence, it allows militias in Iraq to rise up and attack the Kurds, which is why our Smith evidence indicates it catalyzed Kurds elsewhere to start a regional conflict, killing tens of millions. Their responses about like troops being deployed, only 500, only prevent other countries from invading, but it doesn't start militias from escalating conflicts against the Kurds, which is why we still gain offense here. Now, on our contention 3 about the nuclearization, they give you 5 responses. The first comes from the New York Times, which indicates that Iran will nuclearize no matter what. That's not true for 2 reasons. First, because they're trying to get a deal with the EU through the GCPOA, which is why if they ever nuclearize, that deal falls through, but they really want it. But second, it doesn't take into account that they don't take into account that it risks relationships elsewhere, which is why it would never happen. Then second, they say that Turkey's getting nuclear weapons. First, that's just factually not true. They're not getting nuclear weapons right now, but even if they did, it doesn't even be seen as a threat by Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia and Turkey are on good terms. Then their third response about the non-proliferation Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 4th about the UNSC, and the 5 about economic sanctions, the end result is all economic sanctions. So you can group them together. There are 2 reasons why economic sanctions would never happen. First comes from Langios, who explains that economic sanctions would cause oil prices to go to $200. Remember, Trump doesn't want oil sanctions because that destroys his re-election chances, and it would just cause the global economy to get much worse. Second comes from our Gazansky evidence, which indicates that MBS cares far more about domestic threats than any kind of economic relations. So even if sanctions did put on, he'd still pursue. Then our argument is, then finally on the impact, the only response they make is that the Israel-Saudi relations are good. They pretty much concede our proxy war impact. The NRC evidence, or the Meyer evidence indicates that they could use nuclear escalation to threaten other larger powers, causing 54% more proxy wars than the NRC evidence indicates it put 54 million lives at risk. So the link is pretty clear. Right now, Theo believes that the Theo evidence indicates that Saudi Arabia won't nuclearize because they're protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella, but the Gazansky evidence indicates that once you pull out the troops, they start to nuclearize. So this outweighs their case on 2 ways. First is scope, because a regional escalation and destabilization is greater than any of the small conflicts that they have. Way more lives get hurt. But second is on time frame, because once they have nuclear weapons, they're going to do conflicts for the indefinite future, which is why their conflicts are only short term. So let's go to their case. At the top, Kevin reads this Iran hardliners overview. They say empirically it's not true, and the goal the goal is only to oust the U.S. But the Brookings evidence indicates from '79 it's always been to expand not just the U.S. So that's why empirically they're going to aggress no matter what, and their plan only would be shown it's working if we pull out. Then they say that war is non-unique, but problematically they also concede 2 reasons why the U.S. being there makes the war far better. First is because U.S. leverage, because right now they're able to use U.S. leverage to stop moderates from doing far more conflict, and second is because of logistics, because there's far less collateral damage. Remember, if they want to get to a point, they'd have to march all the way through, which means more people get killed. That means the Yemen conflict is only far worse in their world because they have to march all the way through and kill so many civilians. Then on their contention too about Iraq, they can see 2 reasons why the U.S. would never want to go to war. 1, because 70% of Americans don't support it, but 2 is because of oil prices. That means no escalation ever happens because the U.S. doesn't want to escalate the war. It has to be 2 sides escalating if a full-blown war ever goes out. If they concede 2 reasons why the U.S. would never escalate, a full-blown war never happens.
Yeah, no, that was great. I'm going to take some prep time and we'll start now.
We'll just say that was all of our prep.
It was.
Okay. All right. So off the clock, starting off with your Iran overview, then your thing on Yemen, and then Iraq, and then your contention 2, and then 3. Okay. Is everybody good? Awesome. Okay. So my time starts now. Starting off with their overview on Iran, what they never respond to is Iran expands in the past, but they never actually start conflicts. The only time there's a possibility of conflict is when the U.S. is there. Look to Syria and Iraq. Iran expanded in both instances, but war ended. It didn't stop. They have no offense in this overview. Then on our contention 1 in Yemen, they just keep trying to extend this point that the war may get a little bit worse. 1, there's no contextualization whatsoever how much worse, but 2, it's never weighed. Don't let them go for this. And final focus, there's no offense here. But their contention 2 on Iraq is really problematic for them. The only response they extend is this idea that there's no support for war. The problem is Trump literally defends this when he killed Soleimani, which shows the biggest escalation either side ever made, but 2, he increased troops as well as military bases in the region. Insofar as this is true, their only defense is taken out. But the problem with that is they concede our second and third link in their summary. Our second link, incentive structure, is really, really good because Kevin doesn't even respond to it, even though he's so good at rebuttal. The biggest thing about it is this idea that what happens is when Iran is construed by this confluence of crises, Iran only has one option, is to go to this diversionary conflict, because the hardliners are going to lose power if they don't get the United States out. They would negotiate if the U.S. had left, because otherwise, if the U.S. is still there, it's a capitulation to them. So the only side where there's no conflict is when the U.S. leaves. We tell you in the status quo, the trend is towards conflict. Therefore, the only side with any risk of ending that chance is the affirmative side by removing the U.S. out and preventing any actual possibility. But then our third link about militias also is conceded by Carter, because remember what we tell you, that these militias are Iranian-backed but are becoming more and more aggressive to push the United States out. Remember, the U.S. is not leaving. Therefore, if the U.S. does not leave right now, the conflict is only going to erupt. Remember, Kevin does not touch our impact. Our impact is conceded. A U.S. and Iran war would kill 1.5 to 2 million lives. This is going to outweigh on 3 fronts. First, on magnitude. Remember, even if they win that their 10 proxy conflicts erupt, it still does not add up to the amount of lives that U.S. and Iran conflict would have. But second of all, on clarity, we're giving you a specific conflict that occurs. We're giving you where it occurs. They just say that conflict may arise in the future. Where does it arise? Who are the actors, and why is it actually going to happen? They never explain this. But third, on time frame, they say they win time frame because then when Saudi Arabia gets nukes, then they cause all this conflict. When does Saudi Arabia get nukes? It takes a long time to actually generate nukes. Countries have taken decades to get nukes. We're telling you in the status quo, it's trending towards war, which means we're going to outweigh on time frame. The war happens a lot quicker than their war happens. But let's go to their case. First of all, on Kurds, the biggest problem is that the Kurds have already signed a treaty with Russia, which means that the Kurds are being protected just as well as the U.S. would. That's a problem for them because insofar as it's true, these these militias aren't rising up. There's no civil war problem, but also they don't give you a time frame, and they also don't weigh this impact whatsoever. Don't let them weigh in final focus. But then on their contention 3 and nuclearization, the biggest problem is even if Iran has these incentives not to do it, they're doing it anyways, which is why they say that Iran's going to nuclearize within 4 to 5 months. This means that this actually triggers their impact no matter what. But in addition, they never, in terms of their Israel impact, it doesn't even matter because remember what we tell you, that Israel has preemptively struck in the past and it did not lead to war. Iran's already nuclearizing, which means Saudi Arabia inevitably is going to nuclearize. But even if Saudi Arabia nuclearizes in the future, they don't tell you why there's going to be conflicts arising, and they don't tell you when. Don't weigh this contention at all. Kevin's going to try and do it in final focus. It's game over.
All right, you ready for Cran Cross?
Yeah.
Okay. So can we get the first question, right?
You do.
Okay, so time begins now. So let's talk about the weighing that you give on time frame. You say it takes a super long time for people to get nukes, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
So was this a response made in rebuttal?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. So
No,
like, if you had said this, right, we would have responded to it by telling
I have
you
it on the
that
flow.
they could easily get it from North Korea or Pakistan and just buy it off the shelf. So it's not something that
What
takes,
do you mean,
like
buy
a
it?
year.
Like, they're not selling nukes.
North
They're
Korea
maybe
would
selling
sell nukes.
parts.
If you had made this analysis, we would have explained why North Korea would do it and that how it would come.
Kevin,
fast.
nobody just sells nukes, man. That's not how it
No.
works. You
Well,
sell
our
parts.
tech evidence
they put the
indicates
parts together. Still,
no.
they need
There's
the
many
equipment,
different things
they
you
need
can
all
do,
the
Vinay. You can
technology.
also sell warheads. So what our evidence indicates is that North Korea has an incentive to do so because they want to ally with other countries that are internationally isolated.
Mhm.
And Saudi Arabia, as you say, if the United States withdraws from the region, would become
Has North
internationally
Korea ever
isolated.
sold nukes?
Yes, they have given nukes to other countries in the Middle
who?
East. For example, they were selling parts to Iran, and they've also given
Parts.
countries like Iraq and Syria
Parts
to
is
start
different.
nuclearizing their own.
It's still like, okay, they're selling parts to Iran, which is why Iran has started building.
Well,
but
they
that
gave it
also
to
takes
Iraq
out
and
your
Syria,
only
and then there's a
front line
preemptive
because you
strike.
say that Iran was never going to nuclearize, but like if Iran is buying parts from North Korea and they're already on the trend,
Okay,
then
sure. So they bought parts. They didn't actually end up nuclearizing because of the GCPOA, right? So that's like a
no,
totally
that's
different
not
part
true.
of history.
That's why our
Yes, it
evidence is
is.
so explicit in saying they're going to end up with a nuclear weapon in 4 to 5 months, Kevin.
Vinay, I've read your evidence, right? So it talks about them breaching the uranium limit after the United States left
No,
the
Kevin,
GCPOA.
Kevin,
Then
Kevin.
the
It's
EU
pretty,
returned to the
it's like
table.
literally.
Like, Vinay,
It's
I know all your
verbatim.
evidence, okay? I've
It's
read all
like
of it.
verbatim, Kevin. 4
No,
to 5 months, Iran has nukes.
No, that's just not what your evidence says.
Literally the
It
quote
says,
we read.
yes, I understand, right? But one, it's outdated because it's right after the United
It's
States
like
left.
2
So
months
then,
ago. It was
Iran,
literally like
no,
2 or 3
no.
months ago.
Okay, Renee, no, it's not. I have your
Yes, it
evidence,
is.
okay?
It's from 2020. Kevin.
No, it's not. It's literally from 2018. And so your evidence says,
Oh my.
right, that
Okay,
after
we
the
can
United States left
show
from
you
the
the card if you
GCPOA,
want.
I mean, I
Like,
have the evidence, right? I looked through your block file
you do,
before this
man, because
tournament.
you're citing some
So-
random other evidence from 2018.
No, look, okay, our evidence is much more specific and recent, okay? And it's
Why?
specific about
But
how
our evidence
after the
is
United
more
States
recent.
left.
All right, this
Right,
is
after the United
pointless.
States
It's not getting into it. Let's agree to
No,
disagree.
it's
Can I
because you
ask
know
a
I'm right.
question?
You know I'm right. Okay, so let's talk about why I'm right. So
Wait, you just
United
asked
States
a
left the
question. Do you
GCPOA.
mind if I ask you a question?
No, you asked the
Would
question
it
first.
hurt
That's
your
my
feelings
turn.
if I asked you a question? Because I really want to.
Okay, fine. Go for it.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about like, okay, yeah, proxy conflicts. Where are they going to start proxy conflicts?
Yeah, so in our overview, we'd specified from Carafano that there's 10 different flashpoints for conflict.
Where?
Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, Liberia. I just named 4.
Syria, Iraq. Okay, so why haven't they started?
Because they haven't nuclearized.
Why is nuclear like okay? So why
Our
is
impact hasn't
it doesn't
happened
even make
yet.
sense,
I mean, I don't
Kevin.
know how to
Like,
not explain
first
it
of all,
to
your
you further
overview
back.
has nothing to do with nuclearization. Your overview is talking about regional hegemony, right?
No, our overview specifically talks about the places that conflict could occur if these countries decided to escalate.
Okay, all right, but
Yeah.
we tell you Iran has expanded in these places before, and conflicts ended. They didn't start, right? So then, why does that matter?
Wait, what does that mean? There's literally been so many civil wars where millions
Iran
of people
helped
died.
Iraq when
Yeah,
the US pulled
the
out.
war died, but 1 million people died too. So okay, I guess that means it doesn't matter. Is what you're
That
saying.
doesn't
It's
make
basically
any
what you're
sense,
saying.
man. All right, that's done.
Okay, so since I don't have any prep time, it's just gonna start off with our contention 3 about nuclearization, weighing for our contention 3, then their arguments about Iraq. Okay, is everyone ready? All right. Time begins now. You can sign your ballot on our contention 3 about nuclearization. They give you 2 responses. First off, they say that Iran is already going to nuclearize, but as I tell you, I know their evidence. Their evidence says after the United States pulled out of the GCPOA, then Iran started to decide to nuclearize and they breached the uranium limit. However, after the EU returned to the table, our evidence indicates that they no longer want to nuclearize because they want to sign a deal with the EU and not get sanctioned by the international community. But secondly, this is once again not responsive to the thesis of our case. Our Kuzanti evidence is very specific that even if Iran got nuclear weapons, as long as the United States is still there to protect them, Saudi Arabia feels no need to nuclearize. So they have missed the nuance of our case completely. The next response they make is that there's no war when Israel preemptively striked in the past, but they have dropped our first impact, which is about the proxy conflicts. We tell you from Meyer, when Saudi Arabia gets their nuclear weapons, they are more aggressive. They can threaten nuclear escalation to create more space to conduct proxy warfare, which is why we see 54% more proxy wars. And our NRC evidence is very quantified. And in case it says for any regional escalation in places like Iraq, Syria, or Bahrain, or Liberia will put 44 million lives at risk. This is all conceded analysis from our case. This is going to outweigh their case.
Ask them what Saudi's incentive is.
This is going to outweigh their case in 2 ways. One, it's on scope because we're talking about regional destabilization, putting 44 million people at risk, whereas their impact is only a couple million people within Iraq. We're definitely outweighing their argument on magnitude. The second way is going to be on probability because there's so many different factors that are going to influence negotiations, which means the negotiations between the United States and Iran have an inherent probability of failing, whereas you know for sure once the United States leaves the region, Saudi Arabia feels the need to nuclearize and proliferate, which leads to more escalation into the future. They've conceded 100% of the case. The round is over. But on their case, there's one piece of defense that is game over for them. We tell you that any war is two-sided. Both sides need to want to escalate, but we tell you the United States will never do so. A, because 70% of Americans oppose it, and secondly, it would spike oil prices, which hurts his election campaign. He says 2 things. First off, he says they killed Soleimani, and then secondly, that they increased troops in military bases. Number one, this is a new response. Joey literally conceded in a rebuttal. Don't let him make new analysis. But secondly, we'd also say that even if it's true, the implication here is that even if the United States must respond to save their political face, they're never going to escalate the conflict to a point where it actually leads to this civil war or there's millions of people dying. Sure, the United States might respond in certain ways. That doesn't actually lead to this full-blown war that my opponents talk about, which means they don't even have access to their case.
Wait, Kevin, hold on. What did you say before, like the probability stuff? You were kind of unclear.
Is that because you were talking to Vinay?
No.
I said scope because we see regional destabilization, which puts 44 million people at risk, which is greater than your few million people in Iraq.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so the order will be beginning on our case. going to yours. Our case weighing than your case. Okay. Everyone ready? Okay. Our contention 2 about Iran is the easiest and cleanest place for you to vote in today's round. Our argument is very simple. Our argument is that right now, due to the new economic conditions imposed by really heavy sanctions and coronavirus, hardliners in Iran who have just taken over the government see the need to actually create a diversion to actually portray the U.S. as an aggressor. Thus, they would lash out against the United States and create a war leading to 1.5 million people to 2 million people killed. Then they also concede our third link, which is the fact that Iraqi militias would lash out against the United States, which would lead to would also drag the United States into a war. Ultimately, we say these both lead to a very large impact because they both escalate into a large war. They only extend one response, which is through ink, which is the fact that the U.S. Which is the fact that the U.S. doesn't want war. One, remember, we tell you that fundamentally the U.S. has killed Soleimani. Clearly, Trump does not care too much about the people. But even if you don't buy that, the fact that Iran is going to attack first and the Iraqi militias will attack first means that the U.S. will probably get dragged into the war, even if they don't intentionally want to do so. At that point, the weighing is also very conceded. We outweigh in a few ways. One is on magnitude. Remember, we told you directly a war with Iran would be region-wide and lead to like millions and millions of deaths, 1.5 to 2 million deaths. They just say that 44 million people are at risk, but they don't actually tell you how many deaths. So anything, we would say that death is the worst because it's not reversible. However, we would say even if you don't buy that, we say we also reach a very, very large number, close to 44 million, because even if like it's not 44 million dead, it's still 44 million people at risk, like they themselves tell you. But second, on clarity, remember, we tell you very clearly it would lead to an all-out war. They don't have proof to you any, like, they don't even contextualize where these proxy wars would happen, what the probability is that Iran actually goes to fund these. We have no idea what's going to happen. And thirdly, on time frame, remember, nuclearization takes so long to happen. Like, you need to like Saudi Arabia needs to recognize that the security threat is gone. Then they need to decide that they want nukes. Then they have to get nukes, and all this takes and then Israel has to detect nukes. All this would take so long. Whereas war is literally imminent right now. They say probability. One probability is on our side because we would say that right now it's already happening. But yeah. Let's go to their case. Remember, we tell you that Iran's getting nukes. I encourage you to call the card. Like any observers, I guess, can call the card. It's very good about what it says. They just say that they no longer want to do it, but we would say that Iran is still doing it. And Saudi Arabia, above all, has come out and said that if Iran nukes, they will nuclearize no matter what. So clearly, they care about Iran over their relationship with the United States.
Brilliant round.
Yeah.
Great round, Joey. Not you, Vinay. Only Joey.
I'd like to congratulate the teams from Winston Churchill and Thomas Wooten on a fantastic round. This concludes the Showcase National Speech and Debate Association Senior Open Public Forum Showcase round. Gentlemen, thank you again for your effort today. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for hosting this tournament.